Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our series Mapping the Fraud Blueprint of Tomorrow, brought to you by BDO Australia. My name is Adam Sims. I'm a financial crimes solicitor and forensic services partner at BDO. Recently, the AS 8001, so the Australian Standard 8001, was updated to provide up-to-date guidance on corporate governance relating to fraud and corruption, which you're probably all aware of. This webinar series aims to build your understanding and application of the standard through what we call the 3 T's: tech, transparency, and tone from the top. And we are presenting these in a 3-part series, finishing off today with the third, which is today's session. If you missed the previous 2 sessions on tech and transparency, please visit the webinar series link where you will find a recording to those presentations. Today, we're looking at tone from the top. It's important to emphasize that these sessions are designed to explore these topics and their application to business. So whilst we do refer to the standard, this is more about providing the context as to the why, and we draw on experts to provide this commentary with some practical industry know-how. This aims to drive your curiosity and understanding and position you to ask informed questions. Needless to say, if you need more detailed information about your organisation's circumstances with respect to the new standard, please feel free to reach out. It's also important to note that AS 8001 relates to all organisations operating in Australia. So what we're talking about there is we're talking about publicly listed corporations, proprietary organisations, incorporated and unincorporated associations, and all government departments and agencies. Equally, it applies to non-for-profit and for-profit organisations. In our discussions today, we'll focus on public and proprietary companies with board involvement, but the lessons learned will be applicable across the ambit of all organisations. Now, before we kick things off, I'd like to just quickly draw your attention to some housekeeping. To start, you're all automatically muted, but we'll be accepting questions throughout the session. And you can submit these using the question tab. Hopefully you can find that. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible. However, if we cannot respond to your question, we'll follow up with you after the webinar concludes. If at any time you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please click the support button. Again, hopefully you can find that. If you don't, just send a message through. And finally, this session is being recorded. All registrants will receive a follow-up email containing a link to the recording and speaker contact details. So without further ado, let me introduce our panel of experts. Before I do, I might just turn off my camera because I've got internet connection issues with the NBN, so excuse me for disappearing, just so you know. I'm excited today to be joined by Nigel Hennessy. Nigel is a professional company director, entrepreneur, analytical and strategic advisor. He's had you've had extensive experience, not previous, as a CEO and director for public and private and not-for-profit companies. Nigel is a fellow and counsellor for the Australian Institute of Company Directors. He also sits on the Best Practice and Ethics Committee for the Advisory Board Centre. He holds numerous board and advisory positions in a range of industries. An interesting fact I learned about Nigel this morning is that he is also a mathematical analyst and held a commission in the Royal Navy. He worked in intelligence during the Cold War in the UK with the nuclear submarine fleet, and then later led covert data collection analysis of acoustic data from ships and submarines. That perked my interest, I've got to say, Nigel. It must be a fascinating career story. Nigel, I know you're extremely busy, so thank you for your time today, and thank you for being part of this to give us insight into the inner workings of the board. I'm also joined by Anthony Seyfort, a corporate partner at HWL Ebsworth Lawyers. Anthony is a practice leader and combines a wealth of experience in commercial and administrative law and practical experience with regulated industries. Anthony focuses on governance, transactions and strategic advice for government and regulated industries, and on business dealings between them. He represents clients in dealings with governments and regulators in relation to policy, regulatory change, approvals and negotiated outcomes. He has a large amount of client experience as a former company secretary of a top 100 ASX listed company. Anthony is also the president of the Victorian Government's Health Services Review Council, was also state chairman of the Governance Institute of Australia and is an office bearer and advisor with various industry associations, including the Financial Services Council. Anthony is currently involved in a number of regulatory investigations involving board conduct under scrutiny. Great to have you with us today, Anthony. I appreciate you taking the time to be part of this and give us some legal insights and other insights also.
So we're here.
Lastly, I'm also joined by my very experienced colleague, Mark Griffiths. Mark is a risk advisory partner at BDO. Mark co-leads the risk advisory practice in Sydney, which provides advice to boards and management to identify and assess strategic and operational risks, preparing risk appetite statements and reviewing or preparing risk management frameworks, policies and risk assurance maps, amongst other things. Mark is always my first port of call when we have done work and identified control governance deficiencies. He and his team always provide the perfect value add for remediating these weaknesses. Thanks, Mark, for joining us today.
Thanks, Adam.
All right. I thought it might be useful to, you're gonna have to listen to me a bit longer, I'm sorry, until we end. We'll get the panel involved. I do apologise. I thought it might be useful to provide a bit of context around this notion of tone from the top, particularly in the context of the fraud and corruption standard. What is tone from the top? The term is used to describe an organisation's general ethical climate, as established by its board of directors and senior management. Having good tone at the top is believed by ethics experts in particular to help prevent fraud and other unethical practices. Good tone from the top is considered a prerequisite for organisational ethics and integrity and is aided through good governance practices. It has been said that boards of directors have a dual role. They create the codes of conduct and then they live by them. Indeed, weaknesses in the tone at the top have been associated with most modern financial frauds, and even my own team certainly seen that across many of the more significant investigations we've conducted. With that in mind, let me take you back to the early 2000s. There were some significant corporate collapses globally. There was Enron, that was the American energy giant that succumbed to accounting fraud, and then there was WorldCom. It was a large US communications company, similarly the subject of fraud and additional corporate governance failures. In both, there were criticisms directed to the board for these governance failures. On the other side of the globe in Australia, we had HIH, it's all around the same time I might add, the health insurance giant, and OneTel. Issues in these cases were very similar. Serious deficiencies in corporate governance, including weaknesses in internal control. I think there was some financial reporting issues. There was certainly a lot of problem with the board's scrutiny of management and the conduct of management, but also management's communication with the board. At the time, the focus was shifting to the fact that the boards should have higher level of duty rather than just managing the company, and their responsibility extending through to corporate governance. And basically this space was born, and so was the notion of tone from the top. In Australia, the response was the committee was set up under a guy called Henry Bosch. He was a well-respected Australian businessman at the time, to determine what could be done to promote better standards of corporate governance in this country. As a result, 5 new standards were introduced, which you could see there. Funny enough, AS 8001 is the only one left remaining. And we will talk a bit more about that. I'm not sure the significance of that, but we might touch on that a bit later. And they were designed to provide guidance to boards and senior management in minimising issues around poor governance, management and unethical behaviour. AS 8001 obviously just relates to fraud and corruption risks and assists management primarily to put in place measures to deter fraudulent behaviours, detect them should they occur, and then basically respond to them if all else fails. We'll talk more about all of those a bit later. In the updated standard, we, as in when I say we, I'm talking about the Standards Committee. I was part of the Standards Committee that revised this standard, revisited the concept of tone from the top, and we deliberately distinguished between the board, we called them in the new standard the governing body, and C-suite, we called them top management. Among other things, the updated standard requires the board to, and I'll read from the standard, acknowledge and accept overall accountability for controlling fraud and corruption risks, and in doing so has an awareness of their company's fraud and corruption risk exposures. And lastly, controls the risk both against and by the company. So controls the risk by the company, so committed on the company, but also committed by the company. Whilst the standard replaces responsibility on the board for tone from the top, it shares the execution of it. This is very important. It shares the execution of it with the C-suite. And the last point I'd like to make on this is the change in directive terminology that we adopted. So the old standard spoke about companies should do certain things. This standard talks about shall, so it's giving it a more mandatory tone. Anthony, I'll loop back to you on this point a bit later on. I'd like to pick it up again. I mean, have a look at the other standards that existed in 2003. The one on the screen there's 2008. So it was, 8001, 2008. It was updated in 2008, and that was the last update. So the 2021 update is a long time coming. Standards has a protocol that if standards aren't revised in a 10-year period, then they're usually discontinued. In this case, it was continued, and it thought it was important enough to revise and update. And why was it thought to be important enough? Moving forward to 2021, yikes. I guess it begs the question, has it got any better? Well, I guess if you look at it, we don't see as many large corporate collapses. However, as you can see, Australia is fertile ground for exploring just what is wrong with compliance and governance in this country. Australia is not alone though. We are, but I'll say this, we are featuring with great consistency. It's not just the headlines, it's also, and more impactful, I guess, the findings from inquiries that has everyone looking to the board. But not only the board, to the regulators as well. And this is an important point that we won't go into any great depth about today, but it's an impact on the board. The regulators are under scrutiny like never before. And I can tell you this, the regulatory front line is now advancing. Recently, APRA has set up a new focus on organisational risk culture. ASIC, you may have seen in the media, they've gone into enforcement mode overdrive, and AUSTRAC regularly enforce board ownership of anti-money laundering governance, and have caused board resignations over the last 5 years and massive fines to be applied. To add to this, boards face shareholder backlash, and there is always the looming concern around litigation and class actions. So I guess you could say the stakes are high for the board. Nigel, I've heard in particular one of the unintended consequences for the Westpac board in particular following the money laundering scandal was, and if you remember, that involved child abuse, it was that the directors had their directors insurance cancelled and effectively became uninsurable. In Crown's case, a Crown casino, they were found unsuitable to hold a casino license. Can I ask you two questions? Well, the first one is, what is your view on the question, has it got any better? And then if I could just throw another one at you, why are we still seeing so much going wrong under the Watchful Eye boards?
God, they're hard questions. Well, I will say something before that, because I think it's important to mention. I actually a friend of mine actually was on the board of HIH at the time of its collapse. So I understand what happened there. He joined that board literally only 2 weeks before the collapse occurred, and it highlighted to me the fact that this man was a very senior audit partner. I assume he would have done his due diligence before joining that organisation, but he still ended up in a class action, which cost him a lot of money, cost him his reputation, and basically cost him his career. So it was a very expensive 2-week exercise for him to go on the HIH board. And I think what it comes up with, in my view, is that the real issue that directors are having is that we always used to look at it from a financial perspective only. So we look at the state of the company. We looked at them from a financial position in terms of what the financials look like. We all looked at it from maybe a legal perspective. But what we never looked at, probably in those days, and this really highlighted it to me, we never looked at the culture. We never looked at the people issues. We never dug deep enough. And I think that these days, a director has to look at not just the board and the financials and the legal. They've got to look at the directors and the background of those directors, their track record, their experiences. And the same thing goes with the executive team. And it also really, they've got to understand the market the company's in and also the technology which is likely to be applied. Unless you actually know or got a good idea of all that, then the risk is still very high. All right, and my personal view is it's not improved. We get some exposures occasionally. Many things go underground. We just don't know about them. I will tell you about some of those a bit later, which I've experienced myself, where there's been some situations arise which have gone underground. So it's not much better than it was probably. We're still going to find it, and it really does come, in my view, it comes down to a cultural separation a lot of the time between the board and the C-suite, which is really where the problem lies. All right, that answers your question.
It does actually, and I mean the change that has occurred or is occurring, if I read between the lines there, how long has that been happening for?
Oh, I know it's been happening a long time. I think that there's a lot of good intent, all right, and I actually, a good example is I actually sit on the council, as you know, for the AICD for New South Wales, and I'm part of the committee which actually decides on fellows. And I complain every month when I look at the fellow list which comes in, and we look at the fellows list not on the basis of experience in terms of how many years of different types of experiences the directors have, which I think is critical. We look at it in terms of what size of the business that they've managed in the past. And to be frank, the size of the business is almost irrelevant. And for directors, a good director, in my view, has to be able to manage a $1 billion operation in terms of understanding the governance as much as a startup. And to be fair, running a startup is a damn sight harder than running a big business because you don't get the support. So you've got to have the knowledge base. And I think it's that broad knowledge base, which I think is still very much missing and is not promoted enough, I think, in the sector.
Yeah, okay, interesting. So the board diversity, I was going to ask you about that a bit later, and maybe this is the time to ask you about that. What's your thoughts on where boards are heading? I mean, you're talking about the skills and the scrutiny over the directors coming on to the board, but what about diversity? You know, technology is a big issue in the current age. Do board members need to possess knowledge of technology?
I think it's important that they have a good round background, a good solid background which is well-rounded. My personal view is you don't like experts. If you get an expert on the board tends to abdicate responsibility to that particular expert, and that's the worst position the board can get into. And the board must be in a position where it can make a decision based upon the information it's got around it, and that usually means a good director to me is somebody who's well-rounded, has lots of experiences, and therefore can relate to those experiences and can understand that I'm like with cyber risk, that the implications of that in terms of data, it's quite extreme. I mean, it really is quite bad news for a company to get caught up in that. But to bring on board an expert who's a cyber expert, to me, is the worst thing you can do, because you're going to get one view about what the company should do, and it may not be the right one. You might get the wrong view. So you've really got to bring in experts. That's why I got involved with advisory boards, because I think the best way of moving forward in many ways is by getting a good advisory board involved. To actually do projects along those lines, which allows you to understand various implications of making a particular decision in one direction or another. And I think that's what we need to do. So I think so. The directors need to be solid, well-rounded individuals with lots of experiences, and not just have come from one area, which I think is where the problem lies, actually.
That makes sense. Mark and Anthony, I'm interested to know what your observations have been, both from a risk and a legal perspective in this regard too.
Well, apart from being a lawyer and attending many board meetings as a lawyer, I was a listed company secretary for 5 years, as you mentioned before, Adam. And there were a couple of directors on that company who, even after 5 years, I would sit there at the meetings and think, do you really understand what's going on in this business? They really didn't. You often get a lot of celebrity directors and people who don't understand. Expectations are rising on directors, and I'll hold my comments on directors' duties till you ask, Adam. But expectations are rising on directors, and I think directors are getting better. But I think you know, it's all about sort of staying alert and staying on edge. And I certainly agree with Nigel's comment about not having experts on boards, or at least not relying on experts on boards. I mean, everybody's got to know enough about something. You don't have to have detailed knowledge of all the different areas, but you need to know the right questions to ask. And the advantage of having a lot of directors knowing a little bit about a lot of things, that they'll hopefully ask questions from different perspectives. But now over to you, Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. Yeah, Adam, I think it's quite variable in terms of what we're seeing in terms of maturity, perhaps, of some of the boards, and therefore the directors, and I guess the questioning perhaps of management. And the mix of directors and their skill sets and their backgrounds, I would say, have certainly been enhanced over the last sort of 3 to 4 years. But I think there's still some issues there, as Anthony alluded to, in regards to just some of the questioning or absence of. And as a service provider, that's sometimes quite challenging, because you feel as though you're also challenging the board yourself in regards to, well, should you not be asking us a question? Should you not be asking management a question of a particular area? And so with Nigel's comment, we're seeing more and more experts joining the board, and that is seeing the board going in a particular direction around question, but also in regards to some of the topical areas that are being discussed and on the agendas for boards. And the top 3, Nigel mentioned cyber being one of them, employee underpayment being another, and I guess the other one that's sort of becoming a lot more topical around sort of ESG related issues. It's almost like there's a bit of a checklist there, and I think that's a little bit of a concern for me in regards to directors that we engage with are on multiple boards, and we see them time and time again, and regardless of the industry that they're actually representing, it's the same sort of questioning. And I think that's probably where the evolution is required in regards to, well, you really need to understand the industry or the client that you're representing as a director at that point in time, versus what feels a little bit like a little bit of a blanket range of questions and topics that are being covered.
Yeah. All right, thanks for that. I want to explore the interrelationship between the board and then the C-suite a bit later on, and we can probably come back and circle back to this. I've got a question from the audience. Do you feel, so anyone can answer this, do you feel boards are doing enough to understand their role in ensuring their company is free from crime and other serious behaviours, i.e. not just fraud, but also workplace bullying and harassment? I'd say looking at that slide, no. Might be unfair though.
I think no.
Yeah, okay. Right. As can be seen here, modern boards face a lot of potential issues, and they've got a lot of things to worry about. And the other thing about these is that some of these can often occur simultaneously, and as I'm sure the panel would have seen. This is not a comprehensive list, so don't, whatever's there, don't think, oh, we haven't got such and such. I mean, this is just a list. The demonstration here is that there's a lot going on, and there's many more. In our last 2 webinars, we dealt with other emerging issues from the updated standards. So cyber was one of them, and cyber-related, well, more importantly, cyber-related crime. And then the second was around transparency, and there we focused on the issues of whistleblowing, or the topics of whistleblowing and understanding third-party relationships. In our transparency discussions, we gave examples of how we now live in a very transparent era. And if a company's not doing the right thing or they're covering up something, it will be made public soon enough. And I'm sure that's at the forefront of every board member's mind. Nigel, an open question. What are you seeing the typical modern board worrying about in a contemporary sense? Sorry if I can leave it as general as that. With all these risks, if you look at the slide there, with all these risks floating around their business.
Yeah, I think
what's keeping them up at night, I guess, is if I put it that way.
I think the one which is on the lips of the brains, I should say, of most of them, in fact, is misbehaviour, to be fair. And it's the one which I see more often, and it's the one which I see one as becoming more difficult to manage, because it used to be a much simpler process. If you go back 20, 25 years ago, and you didn't get a lot. You got misconduct, but you could actually handle with it. These days, you've got to worry a bit more about historical misconduct. You've got to concern yourself about what record keeping in relation to that. I've recently been through one which was a misconduct affair, and I went through one with the CEO of all things, where I had to deal with a CEO which had a complaint against them, and we had quite a comprehensive process of doing a review, and we had quite a comprehensive mechanism for assessing whether the person was guilty or not guilty, and to what level, and what the crime, if what was the punishment which we would enforce upon that person. Now, whistleblower policy comes into play as well at the same time. In fairness, the COVID-19 one is becoming an interesting one now, and it's becoming more interesting now than it probably was 3 or 4 months ago. So we're finding that one an interesting one. The other one I want to quickly mention is fraud. Again, I come back to fraud because my first experience was in that area, and I had 2 experiences in that. When I first came to Australia, I'd arranged to go and work for a company from the UK, which was coming to Sydney. And about a month before I was due to come over, they cancelled everything. They cancelled the company basically in Sydney. And I thought, what the hell is going on here? But I still decided to come to Sydney. I got a job elsewhere. And it was about 8 years later that I formed a company, and I was looking for funding. And I went back to this company in the UK and said, would you be interested in funding this business? And they did. They did fund it. And as a result of that, I got access to the records of what happened back in the early 80s to this particular company. And I found out that the finance director from the UK had been basically using the company in Australia as a means to defraud the business in the UK. And it actually walked away with over $1 million, which at the time was a lot of money. And he was buying, I think he bought 3 properties in Mossman, gives you an idea how much money today that would be worth. So he bought these properties in Mossman. Now, that was buried, and it was buried completely by the company, because the impact on the stock price, the impact on the reputation of the company was potentially so severe, it was worth a great deal more to bury it. No, it's worth to them a lot more just to bury it than it was to let it go live and become public. So that's one situation I had. Another one I had sometime later was another organization where I was regional managing director, and just joined the company, and I go through a very rigorous due diligence process where I do what I call the good, the bad, and the ugly. So I look at everything you can think of within the company, and a flag came up when I was doing my ugly bit, which is really my systemic issues. And I checked on it. I brought in a forensic accountant to do a review, and we discovered that a PA actually to the marketing director had actually, believe it or not, over a period of about 3 years, had defrauded the company of something like $600,000 through spurious and questionable claims for cash. That person I suspended immediately. I called the police in. We went down the usual process of taking action against that individual, which I personally can't stand. Fraud, to me, it's one of the worst crimes. And the UK, no, so it wasn't UK in this case, it was a European-based company, where it was headquartered, decided again not to pursue. So even though I, as a local managing director, wanted to force this, the European-based company decided they did not because of the issues related to impact on its share price. So disappointing. And I still believe that many things are now still happening, and they've been buried for that very reason, because it's about share price, it's about value. Unfortunately, it's not about culture, it's about value, which is disappointing, but that's the way it tends to work. Okay.
Yeah, I totally agree. In fact, we had a fraud. We investigated a fraud a couple of years back. It was about $4.9 million, and it involved the company accountant. And he had basically he had a gambling issue, and he had gambled over an online internet account $72 million in the same period that he took the 4.9. But when we went back and did some due diligence, so that background checking that you mentioned, which is very important, and we spoke about that during our transparency seminar, the last one, we found that he was doing exactly the same thing in the previous business, and they were just keen to get rid of him, and they did exactly that. They swept it under the carpet. So all you're doing, if you do that, is displacing the issue, and it's going to continue. The other thing that I'm often talking about with clients when we go in and deal with frauds is recovery. It's so important. You need to act so quickly. And if money's sitting in an account, or through the investigation we can find where the funds have gone to, or even if they've gone into a house, for example, in that case, the 4.9 million, we were able to seize a car, we seized a boat, we seized a house, and we also froze an account with money in it. So, you know, you're potentially missing out on recovery of the money. So it's not always a bad story. Mark, you're working with a lot of boards at the moment, and sometimes we work together on these. What are you seeing in engagements coming in? What are the boards asking for help with in this space?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I alluded to some of them a little bit earlier, but I mean, actually, fraud risk assessment is now back in vogue, which I think is great. Obviously, being a little bit biased, and that's sort of suits us in terms of opportunities. But actually, if I think about the plans of work that we're discussing with clients, they're very much looking at revisiting what the fraud risks might be, and a lot of it because of I guess the new working environment that we have with the pandemic, with people working from home more so, and I guess, you know, out of sight, out of mind. So it's great to see that that's actually coming onto the agenda again in terms of revisiting fraud risk assessments, and they haven't been done in some cases for a number of years by clients. But that's excellent that that's occurring. We mentioned cyber briefly earlier, and I mentioned the good old underpayment side. So if I think about the last 2 years in particular, the pay against award in regards to underpayment of employees has been a significant issue on the agenda of the boards that I've been attending, and I think the issue there has been just lack of understanding in regards to the complexity around some of the awards and enterprise agreements that are in place, and therefore the ability of the organisations to actually put in the appropriate controls, checks and balances, and utilisation of systems to actually identify any problems there. And the issue for directors in those organisations is it's the employees that are finding the issues, as opposed to management bringing those to the employees' attention and therefore to the board's attention. So unfortunately, you know, boards are being caught out in that regard. And there's changes in legislation that we've seen in other jurisdictions in Victoria in regards to directors also being liable in regards to underpayment. So that's very, very topical. Modern slavery is interesting. I think that was a bit of a slow start there in regards to modern slavery and the preparation around modern slavery statements. But again, you know, we're seeing a number of organisations reaching out for support in enhancing their understanding of their supply chain, and I think that's all heading towards a broader focus around ESG, which is the environmental, social, and corporate governance focus for boards. And even a number of not-for-profits that I've been working with recently, you know, ESG is on the agenda for them in regards to what does that mean for their own investment portfolio around where are they now looking to to invest, which is important for their sustainability. So they're just a few, Adam, that are really topical right now.
Excellent. And a question came in just before you started. So you either have ESP or you saw the question. And the question is, how does the board keep on top of and even ahead of business risks it is exposed to? And the obvious answer out of your question, out of your reply there, was the risk assessment process. And that's not only for fraud, but other crime types as well, or more broadly, an enterprise risk assessment, taking into account all fraud, crime types and other risks the business faces. Yeah, is that it, Mark? Is there anything else?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think and we might be coming to it a bit later on, Adam, but you mentioned risk assessment, and I guess in light of COVID, again, it's an area that's being revisited, because I think it's been seen to, it's come to light that I guess the number of risk assessments that were prepared and the level of engagement perhaps between C-suite and the board maybe wasn't quite at the right level. And so a number of those operational risks for organizations probably weren't getting the attention that they deserved. And so there's a number of clients that are taking the opportunity to revisit their risk assessments and how the board and C-suite engage in regards to the risk profile and even risk appetite.
Absolutely.
And I think if I might jump in, Adam, I think getting boards involved in the risk assessment process is really important, because when you look at the slide you've got on the screen in front of you, the thought that's been going through my mind as Nigel and Mark has been talking is the challenge facing boards is there's this whole kaleidoscope of issues, and they pop up from time to time because there's a new standard or because there's a new piece of legislation, in the case of modern slavery, and they become the flavour of the day. But it's important for directors to step back and do two things. One is see, yes, they need to deal with this new regime, but it needs to be integrated as part of a risk management system. And then my comment about risk assessment is we've got the challenge of the boards being focused with all these reactive checking things, but boards have got to remember they're also there to be strategic and to run the business. So wearing their positive hats, they're focused on strategy. They need to draw the linkages. Often the risks are the flip sides of the strategic choices they're making. For example, operating in an overseas market or remunerating intermediaries a certain way. And it's often those choices they make about strategy, about the markets and the forms of remuneration, that actually sow the seeds of the risks that could be the source of the corruption or the fraud. So it's all holistic, and it's very important not to deal with these things in boxes. I know it's easy to say and hard to do, but that's the challenge for the board, to sort of look at the positive and the negative and draw the linkages, and they can't just think, all right, this person's thinking about fraud. It's all part of risk management, risk assessment, and link back to the positive strategy.
Yeah, very good comment. Thank you. While I've got you, don't go away yet. Director's duties, you can see it down there in the right. I'd like to know more about director's duties. It's something that I think, from my view, is a little bit misunderstood, whether it's by the board or C-suite or even employees of the company. Can you give us a bit of a rundown on what they're there to do and really how they control the board in terms of their actions and responsibilities?
Yeah, well, I might give a surprising answer for a lawyer and say that directors shouldn't be worried about directors' duties. They should just be worried about doing their job, because the duties are all linked to doing their job. So there's the main duty, which I'll talk about, which is the duty of care and diligence, which basically means that they need to pay attention, do their job and do their job properly, and not be asleep at the wheel. There's also duties about acting in good faith for a proper purpose in the best interests of the company. Now, if they're not going to do that, they shouldn't be doing the job. And there's all sorts of duties that touch on conflicts of interest, including misusing positions and misusing information. If a director's really focused on the business, working hard, doing the right things, ordinarily you shouldn't run into a problem with directors' duties, but given that you've asked, Adam, the really key duty in this area of sort of fraud and corruption, and the duty I think that's invoked by the discussion we're having about this Australian standard is the duty of care and diligence. Directors have to have a duty of care and diligence. They just have to be diligent. They can't be asleep at the wheel. And in some ways, it's a high threshold to breach the duty of care and diligence. Because there's this thing which some people will be aware of called the business judgment rule, and the business judgment rule basically says that if you're free of material personal interest, you're acting in good faith, you've informed yourself, and you genuinely think you're acting in the best interest of the company, you're deemed to have satisfied your duty of care and diligence. But I'd challenge everybody to say that when it comes to this area of establishing systems for fraud and corruption that flow from or encouraged by the Australian standard, you might not be able to rely on the business judgment rule, because one of the requirements of the business judgment rule is you've got no material personal interest. Now, certainly for executive directors around the table, they do have a material personal interest in the fraud and corruption systems. So if it turned out down the track that something was deficient, to have done something which wasn't good enough may not be excused by the business judgment rule because they actually had a material personal interest. Yeah, so that's, I mean, I could say a lot more about duties, Adam, but I think that's the key thing. It's all about being diligent. And what does that mean in practical terms? Yes, they need to understand it. They need to have a good, adopt the sort of measures, the sort of fraud and control system the Australian standard talks about, but they need to embed it in a broader risk management system and culture. And they, I think in this area, because at least the executive directors, if not arguably all of them, have a potential personal interest in it, the element of external advice and external design is really important.
No, good comments. I mentioned I was going to come back to something before, and this might be the time to raise it. And look, it might be not the right time to bring it in, but I will anyway. The standards language has turned to shall, making it more definitive. Standards aren't law, so they're not legislation. They're a mere guidance, but they are a standard and they are an industry guidance. Any impact on directors' duties, or do you have a comment on how that change in language affects directors?
Well, I think the change of language obviously sharpens it up and makes it sound a bit more legalistic. Is actually with them. No disrespect to the committee, Adam. I think with move to plain English drafting, I never use the word shall. We use words like must, but it's making it a bit more legalistic. But I think going to your question about the legal significance, although the Australian standard isn't law, when you do have Australian standards in areas, they provide a really important benchmark for establishing has there been sufficient effort, endeavour, diligence for meeting the duty of care and diligence. And then on the flip side, if on a particular issue a court finds that the directors fall short of their duties, courts also have discretions as to whether they impose any penalty in relation to that. So if there is some failing, directors are held liable, and there's a whole range of ways you can get there. The attention turns to, well, what have they done, and how excusable is it? And again, adopting measures and systems that are consistent with an Australian standard, I think takes you a long way down the track of saying, well, we've done something pretty worthy. It may not totally excuse the particular failure in the particular instance, but that there was a systemic attempt there to do the right thing. So I think whilst the standard's not law, I think it's really important, and I think people should treat it as if it's well, it's a standard, but treat it as if it almost is law.
Yeah, that's certainly consistent with what I've seen too. I mean, I've seen them used in tribunals and heard of them being used in court matters for reference. So they certainly do. I believe it certainly has an impact if you do adhere to it. Okay, so we might move on. We're just conscious of time. Right, so you'll see the title there, the board, C-suite and risk culture. I think this is really where the rubber hits the road. And here I want to explore the interplay, I mentioned it earlier, between the board and C-suite in understanding both the organisational risk and the governance which that risk requires. Because personally, I see this as a crucial area to organisational culture. So there's that word culture and successful tone from the top. But first, you can see there are a myriad of regulatory guidances. We just spoke about, you know, the fact that there are a lot. There's standards. There's legislation now coming out with a focus on risk culture. And I think most recently, APRA has broadened its focus in relation to its regulated entities on transforming governance, culture, risk, and accountability. I think it was and it's done this by running a pilot risk culture survey. And it's done that, I believe, as a pilot test through some of its insurance reporting entities. But what they're looking at there is the board and C-suite's performance introspectively. So from within the organisation and having the employees within the organisation provide an assessment on that. I think it's safe to say it's anticipated that this will be, you know, further broadened across the range of regulated entities that APRA looks after and really should be seen as a focus moving forward. Interestingly, our BDO people and culture team have been doing this for some time. So, you know, we as a firm have been moving in this direction, advising clients on it, and now that APRA has taken that up, I believe it's here to stay. But I've always been interested in the interplay between board and C-suite, particularly in how they carry this out and how they endeavour to get it right. You know, particularly if you think about the APRA pilot that's going on. I've had a few instances where, say for instance, a CFO reaches out to me and wants to engage for maybe a whistleblowing service, or indeed the most recent one was the fraud risk assessment. And the reasons that in one case he wanted to do that was to drive risk transparency in the business. He's wholeheartedly wanted this ethical culture, and what happened was it needed to be escalated to board, and everything stalled there, and it didn't go ahead because the CFO did not get board approval. I'll open it up to the panel. How does this work in practice, and how do the board and C-suite ensure they are on the same page?
I would say with difficulty a lot of the time. It's to be frank, it's absolutely critical. It's got to be a one team approach. One of the things I've always liked about the European way of boards and board operations is that they have multiple eyes. When I used to report back to the UK in one company as the CEO, my finance director was also reporting back to his counterpart in the UK, as was my commercial director was reporting back to the UK. So we had a multiple way of getting information back and forth. And I think this idea, this structure works quite well in a board as well. I know the CEO is the person responsible for management of the company, but I like to see a situation arise where you do get some level of transparency between the executive and the board themselves. I'm not suggesting the board go and knock on the door of the executive, but there should be an open door, if required, between the CFO, for instance, and the board if they have an issue of any kind. And my view is always to try to maintain a high level of transparency. No secrets, don't hide things. It's not about that. I also want to touch briefly upon something we touched upon earlier, which I think is actually quite important, just quickly, is that when it comes to the composition again of the actual board itself, this is why I think it's so important to get these generalists involved and not specialists, because you tend to get a CFO reporting to the board and reports either through the audit committee or he reports into another individual who's a finance person, which I think is the wrong way of looking at it, because risk is not just risk. There's also the opposite of risk, which is opportunity. And I feel that many boards don't look at the opportunities going forward. They look too much at just the risks. And a good board, in fact, looks at both ways. You don't spend all your time looking in the rear view mirror to see what you've been doing in the past. You should be looking out the windscreen of the car to see what's coming ahead in terms of disruptions coming ahead. Now, I wrote a paper, again, if anyone's interested, I wrote a paper years ago for the AICD, which I called the Entrepreneurial Board, which was designed to try to get people to think about the disruptions around the corner, what technology is going to occur, what market changes will happen. Will there be another COVID? No, COVID-22 or something like that, which will pop out the woodwork in the future. These are things which the board needs to think about, but also look at them as being potential advantages and opportunities. And that's all part of the culture, I think, trying to get that to come across and get the board to operate closely with the C-suite, to me, is absolutely essential. Without that, you don't have a good organization.
Yeah, Mark, thank you, Nigel. That was great. Mark, that kind of it segues into a conversation we were having yesterday around risk opportunity, and I guess a question by extension to that is how much does the risk appetite drive what we're talking about here, and particularly how the board and C-suite really do get on the same page?
Look, I think it's significant, Adam, and Nigel, apologies, we probably haven't referenced your paper in the discussions that we've been having with our clients recently, but we're certainly encouraging.
That may change.
That may well change. That's right. But we're certainly encouraging our clients to, shift the dial in terms of the conversation around risk appetite to be, risk and opportunity appetites, and it actually makes a huge difference in regards to the level of discussion and dialogue that you have, and also the foresight that the board and the executive have when you shift that conversation to risk and opportunity appetite. And I was chatting with Adam yesterday about a client that we've recently facilitated a session with management and with the board, and there was complete misalignment between the board and management in regards to risk appetite, and so we very intentionally shifted the discussion, even though they didn't ask for this, to a risk and opportunity discussion. And at the end of the session, they've got greater clarity, I would say, in regards to, well, where does the board want to take the organization? This is the level of risk and opportunity that they see in the organization in terms of fulfilling its mission in this particular case, versus management's very risk-averse view that we don't think the board will want us to take that level of risk, and therefore, we'll stay well clear. So that shift in discussion has been helpful. It's one that I would say is fairly immature still at this stage, but in any conversation that we have, or an opportunity that we have, I should say, with a client to revisit their risk management framework or revisit their risk appetite statement, we're actually pushing them towards this broader conversation around risk and opportunity. And therefore, the bringing together of the board and management in that case is actually getting them aligned in regards, well, actually, what is this risk culture thing about? So I think it helps in that conversation as well, Adam.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Look, it just seems like such an important issue to me. And if I think back to the inquiry into Crown in Sydney, Justice Bergen found that a root cause there was poor corporate governance. She also said there was deficient risk management structures. I think it was pretty decentralised and inconsistent across the group. And importantly, there was poor corporate culture. And one of her comments was there was a disconnect between the board and C-suite. And I'm thinking that's just unacceptable and a massive risk.
Absolutely.
I guess let me go to the question from the audience. This is it's interesting. What happens if your business needs to have and you touched on this before, Nigel, a risk-taking mantra to be successful, such as an entrepreneurial company?
Yeah, it's tough. Well, I do a lot with entrepreneurial companies, and it's getting the balance right, because there's a certain level of risk you can afford to take, and there's a certain level of risk you can't. So you've really got to balance one against the other, and I think that's the hardest bit. This is why I said earlier that and I don't think people fully appreciate that if you're a director of a startup company and a young business, growing business, it's actually a lot harder than being the director of an ASX listed company, because you've got to understand that boundary, and that boundary can be tight. I had to put a company last year during COVID into safe harbor, because we had to push the boundaries, and the only way we could do it, if like legally, was by ensuring that we put the company in a position where we put it into a safe harbor type positioning, which actually worked. We brought it out the safe harbor, and the company's now going quite well. But at the time, we had really no choice. But if we'd ploughed ahead with our plans without having that level of comfort that we were also looking at the right things and the right risks, we could have, and the company did go under, we would have been in a bit of a mess from a corporate perspective. So I think it's about the balancing act. It's knowing what you can and what you can't do, and try to stay within that framework. And I think a good board will do that. If it's not a good board, it won't, probably. Does that help? I hope.
Yeah, I think. Sorry, Anthony, go.
Oh, I was going to say I agree with balance. I'd express it slightly differently, or add a slightly different dimension, which is differentiating between different types of risk, because you need to pursue certain risks. And I've read company risk appetites where they say, I mean, you turn open a risk appetite statement, and why isn't the risk appetite low for everything? It's because when it comes to financial risk, or you might have a medium or even a high risk appetite, going to the questioner's question, but we're prepared to take risks, and that we're explicit about it. We need to take risks, but we are not going to take risks on compliance with the law. We're not going to treat people badly, and in a sense, by being explicit about the risks you aren't going to take, which are the sort of the legal regulatory risks, it actually gives you more headroom and justification to take financial risk. People are happy to invest in a company that takes risks, so long as they know the types of risks that they're investing in, and rule out other risks.
Well, to be frank, that's what business actually means. Business is about managing risk to get a reward. Right. If you try to have a risk appetite which is too low, the company will go backwards. So you've got to have a level of risk to move forward.
But it's more politically acceptable to articulate it by saying which risks we won't tolerate, and therefore we will the others. Yep.
And I think that's wholly consistent with what we're seeing come out of the inquiries too. I mean, you can have a strong appetite for risk, but I guess it becomes, what I'm reading between the lines, becomes even more imperative then to have a strong risk culture underpinning that risk, right? So strong monitoring and controls. Okay, that's a great discussion. So I guess what are some of the things that the board, and this is where it becomes more practical, I'm just conscious of time, everyone's come here probably to get a key takeaway, and we will give you that. But as I said when I opened, it's more important to give you the context and arm you with the knowledge to ask the appropriate questions. But what are some of the things the board can put in place at a high level to achieve adequate tone from the top? And here we're talking, and from what we see in some of the work we do, and certainly some of the inquiries and the feedback from them, assessing current state and determining future state corporate culture. It's emerging, it's very important. We're looking now at APRA, one of the more significant regulators, putting in place a culture assessment. That should be an indication, even if you're not regulated by them, that this needs to be done. We mentioned during our conversations about a robust risk assessment undertaken, and let's just not forget, it needs to be undertaken by adequately skilled and experienced staff that have knowledge about the subject matter they're doing a risk assessment on. too often we see risk assessments done by people, and I'll focus on fraud risk assessments that don't have a fraud background, don't understand the subject matter, and don't do it adequately. The other big takeaways from what I mentioned earlier, the training and training of staff, regular awareness training in relation to key business risks, communication from the C-suite to staff as to culture and risk, and that's extended to the board too. And then we look at something called adequate procedures. So that's not in Australia yet, but we're looking at legislation that's floating around in Parliament at the moment in relation to, or in the corruption space, that talks about adequate procedures, which really legislates all this stuff we're talking about, that the companies need to put in place, risk assessments, training, etc. And then importantly, so these are two big matters that have come out of the Banking Royal Commission: the complaint process and adequate investigation of complaints. And by extension to that, whistleblowing hotlines and the process of how you deal with whistleblowers and complaints, very important. And then lastly, the audit review of processes, compliance, and really seeking assurance that it's all on track.
Adam, can I include another one?
Sure.
Adam, is that okay? Look, I think the one which is missing, which I think is rather an important one, is trust. It's the trust between the company, the management, and the board. If you've got trust, and it's got to be mutual trust, it's got to be reciprocated trust. If that, to me, is the crowning glory of everything. If you can get that working within a company, you've solved most of your problems. You've solved the culture issues. You've solved many issues within an organisation. If everyone trusts each other, will do the right thing, and has actually got the company's interests at heart, that to me is the crux of the whole issue.
I totally agree. Trust. Is that something that is generated from this whole assessment of corporate culture, do you think, or is it come from another place?
Out of that, I think that I found that obviously you trust people or you don't trust people, but usually there's an occurrence of something which allows someone to be distrustful. I always try to go in with the view that everyone's trustworthy until they actually show me otherwise. But that's not always the case. You can sense it. I think you can sense the way that people behave. Openness, trustworthiness, to me, transparency, those are the key words which I look for on a board, and that's what I look for from my management team. If one of my management team doesn't like what we're doing, he should say so. I've always run a Chatham House rules process between the executive and the management of the company and the board, and I think that is actually a good way to operate. It's almost like a whistleblower, but it's actually better because it's very open. You know what the issues are, and they're on the table.
Yeah, excellent points. Okay, I'm just mindful we're just gone a bit over time, so we might move to questions. Let's see if this works. Oh, there we go.
Oh, wow.
That was impressive, wasn't it? I have a question from the audience, a couple of questions from the audience. I'll probably just knock two of them off, and then we can go back to the others with a response. If you put yourself out there as an expert on the board, do you leave yourself open to liability? This might be one for you, Anthony.
Well, maybe not leave yourself open to liability, but you might set a higher standard for yourself. So when you look at the judicial consideration of directors' duties, the courts have distinguished between executive directors and non-executive directors. They've distinguished between directors with financial training and not having financial training. So at the margin, I'd say it's not so much putting yourself out there as an expert, but being the expert and, well, possibly putting yourself in a position where the other directors are relying upon you and you know they're relying upon you. You may be raising the standard for yourself legally. So yeah, that's a good point. So that feeds back to Nigel's suggestion that everybody, despite their background and their skill set, comes to this as sort of equal contributors.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. I've got another question here, which is interesting. How does the board want assurance in relation to the governance arrangements being fit for purpose and working? What works? What doesn't? and an example of something you think resonated more. I'm thinking this is for you, Nigel.
I'm just trying to think it through, actually. I'm trying to think which one where we've had a governance. Again, repeat the question and tell me again.
Yeah, sure. Mark, you might have a view on this too. How does the board want assurance in relation to the governance arrangements being fit for purpose and working? What works? What doesn't? I'm assuming they're talking about reporting or what the board receives, and an example of something you think resonated more.
God, that is really quite a tricky question, because I've never run a business by reports, if you like. So I've always tended to expect certain things to be covered when they do write a report. But truthfully, I don't think there is an answer to that question from where I sit. I don't know what it would be. I don't run the company through a governance structure. Governance is if it is an overarching control of the business. It doesn't run. We have other structures in place. The way the company behaves, the way the company operates, I think is moral. It's a moral issue more than a governance issue in many ways. And I've tried to work through that. And I've developed a number of governance structures in the past, and you follow a rote process about how you structure that organization and how the reporting is done. Each company tends to be a little bit different, but they still have the basic same framework. And then there's nuances which will come in as you need them for a particular company. And for one of the companies I'm running now, we run quite a unique process on looking at strategy, which is not being done, I don't think, by anybody else. And we run a constant change process on strategy. So strategy is not something you do once a year and put it on the shelf. Strategy is something you do literally at every board meeting, and in fact between board meetings we actually constantly review it. We're always looking ahead, and that's something which I'm quite strong on, that strategy, you must never assume that what's happening today will be right for in a year's time or 2 years' time. So that I tend to make very fluid and flexible under the board structure, and I think it's up to the board again to try to manage that strategy together with the executive team, and that seems to work quite well. Other companies which are more traditional, strategy can be adopted, but the market is rapidly changing. I even on one of my roles currently, we're finding that, which is an institute, things like the AICD, is that they're constantly changing the way they're behaving. They have this one team approach now. They've gone from being a group of councils across the country to becoming effectively one unit, which is now working as a single entity. So the structure's changed. I'm not sure culturally that was a good move, but because it's actually created problems in itself. But oh well. So I'm not sure that's answered at all, but it's a hard question actually.
It is a hard question. I've been thinking of an answer, Adam. I think obviously it's easier to spot bad governance than good governance, but I think if given the questions about what assurance the board might take, I think the ultimate assurance is the board being truthful with itself, saying, are we operating effectively? And I think the best form of assurance would be one of those facilitated self-assessment processes. Obviously, when it comes to doing basics like, do we have a risk management policy? Do we have a fraud and corruption policy? Which is almost a bit checklist-like. You can get external sign-offs on it. And I've been involved as a lawyer, and I'm sure Mark does all the time, be involved in writing reports to the board and ticking things off. That's only half the story, really. I mean, end of the day, governance is about the board being effective. Are we being effective? And only the board can answer that. And the process of actually sitting down, and I think being facilitated is a good idea, sitting down and assessing our own governance and are we being effective is a great idea, because it's a never-ending journey, as Nigel said. By sitting down and having that discussion, you'll become more effective.
Yeah, agreed, Anthony. And I think it's interesting that the point that you make in regards to who's actually conducting that assessment and often the board is assessing themselves and is fairly likely to give themselves a pat on the back, so to speak. So I guess that external independent perspective would be beneficial, and certainly we're seeing more doing that, which is great. Yeah, the board assurance piece, and I think it's interesting. I mean, we've talked about sort of culture components, and I think that the shift that we've seen is around then the reporting of those indicators. If you want those culture indicators that may not have featured in board reports of the past. So there's this antiquated thing called an assurance map that was in vogue probably about 10-15 years ago, is something that's actually being utilized, and we're being asked to revisit and dust off for a number of our clients around, well, how do we actually as a board get assurance across all of the risks, and where are they actually coming from? But with these other indicators, so all of our reports now, for example, would always include a commentary on culture indicators in the organization. So how good or bad or indifferent was the level of engagement that you had as you were looking at a particular area of the business, and so I guess they're all helping give a level of assurance to the board. But I think Anthony's comment there in regards to its own assessment of its effectiveness is probably where there's some great value to be achieved, I would suggest.
I agree. Thank you. All right, so that brings us to the end. Sorry, we've gone a bit over time. Just quickly, for anyone that's interested, and here's your takeaway. You want to know more about AS 8001, go to our website. There's an article there, and you too can sign up for a checklist. So the checklist has been designed for the board and C-suite. Sorry, Anthony, I need my checklist. And really just it helps educate you around what you need to know from the standard and put in place. This thing's not working. So
just
look,
sorry, just to challenge you, Adam. I don't not like checklists. I just think you use them, but you go beyond them. But they are important, and I'll certainly read yours with interest.
Thanks, Anthony. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the discussion. Thank you again, Nigel, Anthony, and Mark, for your valued insights. Really appreciate your time today. I'm sure you, the listeners, would agree it was a great session, and a lot of insight came out of it. That brings us to the end of our Mapping and Fraud Blueprint for tomorrow's series. We'll be releasing short informative guidances in the new year, further breaking down the standard to assist organisations in understanding their obligations arising out of AS 8001. So please keep an eye out for those. Finally, before we close the session, appreciate if you could fill out a short feedback survey that we'll launch once we close the webinar. It just helps us improve future webinars. Thanks again for joining us today, and please, I wish you all a happy and safe festive break. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys.